Welcome, everyone. My name is Caroline Jones, and I'm here representing the Transmedia Storytelling Initiative in MIT's School of Architecture and Planning. TSI is the producer of tonight's event, 3D 5G, Surveillance and Agency. And I first want to thank Dean Hashim Sarkis for hatching the idea for the Transmedia Initiative, and to funders Nina and David Fialco for giving it wings. The small Transmedia team began thinking about this event last fall when my colleague in the Department of Architecture, Sheila Kennedy, sent me a seductively produced video advertisement showing the coming of 5G broadband service to metropolitan New York. We both sensed the immediate crux represented by the convergence of 3D and 5G technologies. What do we mean by this? Drone-hoisted 3D spatial video and technologies of photogrammetry, both featured in that 5G ad, and pervasive tools in architecture are already here. And when these spatial technologies meet 5G broadband, users gain the capacity to process the streaming data from aerial surveillance in real time. Will publics find this tool useful for their own community monitoring? Or will these capacities produce yet more centralized pooling of our data, this time harvested from above? Such questions are compelling for MIT as a land-grant university born from the technical needs of an industrializing nation, eager to cartographically and demographically capture its settler and indigenous populations. Although we're meeting virtually tonight, I would like to speak the words of MIT's recently achieved land acknowledgement, which is the first step in a much-needed process of truth-telling about the resources appropriated to produce this thriving institution. So here we go. MIT acknowledges indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of this land, recognizing the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation and other language groups. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many indigenous diverse peoples connected to this land from time immemorial. MIT is ready to do this work of an acknowledgement and critique, and I hope that 3D 5G can play a small role in revealing the tools we must wield as engaged citizens. For example, as we gathered to brainstorm this event, we reached out to our colleagues in the Social and Ethical Responsibilities in Computing group, working on the onboarding College of Computing here at MIT. They suggested aero-astro robotics engineer Luca Carlone, whom we are so pleased to include in this discussion tonight with architects Nicholas de Monchaux, Sheila Kennedy, and Brad Samuels. We included in that brainstorming my colleague Sarah Williams, and she kindly agreed to be tonight's moderator. She'll be providing more fulsome introductions to our panelists, and here I need to update you all about the schedule of events. At the last minute, alas, we lost the virtual presence of artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan. Once he realized the time difference, approximately 10 hours later, this new parent of an 8-week-old baby understandably begged off. However, Lawrence has made a quite brilliant and difficult video about his own pioneering of forensic acoustics, and we'll be streaming that video at the end of tonight's conversation. Taking Lawrence's slot in the program, we are thrilled to include the practicing architect Brad Samuels of the firm Situate. Again, Sarah Williams is going to provide much better introductions to our panelists, but suffice it to say that the work of Situate in mapping drone activity for the United Nations, showing us hidden New York, as well as conducting forensics of police encounters with protesters, provide much to discuss for our later conversations. It was generally a boon to have Sarah Williams thinking with us, as her own research in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning here at MIT centers on marshaling data from public records to contribute to community empowerment. Director of the Civic Design Lab and now newly leading the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism, Sarah has recently published her book, Data Action with MIT Press, focusing on harvesting and arranging data in compelling forms to show urban inequities such as rent burden or prisoner reentry and work patterns in the city. Before I met her, I encountered her work as part of the collaboration, the $1 Million Block Project, which she participated in while still a researcher, and a grad student at Columbia. I saw this work at the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition, Design in the Elastic Mind. To summarize its point, the project showed blocks in Brooklyn in which the state was spending $1 million to incarcerate several inhabitants from that single block. The data-rich graphics were arranged to ask the counterfactual question: what would happen if each of those $1 million had been invested into education and social support of those citizens before they were incarcerated? Continuing her focus on equity, Professor Williams' Civic Data Lab has recently produced a project utilizing data from Greater New York given to citizens entitled Visualize New York. Commissioned by the Center for Architecture and opening in November 2020, the virtual exhibition and website continues to invite New Yorkers to think about their urban realities in the run-up to an unprecedented election scheduled for November 2021. Sarah's lab organized data visualizations across 5 key topics: climate change, housing, streets and the public realm, neighborhood health, all with a lens on equity. So without further ado, I want to hand over tonight's program to Sarah Williams, and she will introduce the panelists and set us up for a lively discussion on the civic implications of 3D 5G.
Thanks so much, Caroline, for that wonderful introduction. I would also just say I didn't go to grad school at Columbia. In fact, I went to grad school at MIT, just
thanks. You were brought into that project somewhere in the Columbia.
I was the co-director of that research project in the Spatial Information Design Lab. I was the co-director of the Spatial Information Design Lab while I was also a faculty member there in the planning department before I arrived back at MIT. So I am just going to go share my screen for everyone. So I'm here to give us a little bit of a primer on what 5G and does. Hopefully you guys all know what 3D is already. But the hype around 5G surrounds its ability to process unprecedented amounts of data over cell phone networks, allowing for new technologies such as autonomous vehicles, which depend on the ability to process huge amounts of data in real time. The data created by these vehicles produces a recreation of the world every second, and 5G creates the ability to send this data back in the cloud real time. Here we're looking at this point cloud data coming from Google's autonomous vehicles. And you can just imagine the amount of data that every car creates on the roadways. French CD artist Antoine Delach's 2016 piece critiques this ability to scan our world in real time in a project called Ghost Cells. This 6-minute short creates eerie, almost apocalyptic Paris, and it won the audience prize at the Clermont-Ferrand International Film Festival. And while it's thought that 5G combined with the data that can be connected through drones has the potential to do a lot of good in the world, such as this 3D reconstruction of Italy post-earthquake, or this example of remote surgery as seen in China, all facilitated over a 5G network. There are many potential harms, such as Baltimore's persistent surveillance system.
This is one of our aircraft. It's the one we're using here in Baltimore. This is our camera system. It's 192 million pixels, which makes it about equivalent to 800 video cameras at once. And everything is fed down to the ground live through our data links here. We do wide area surveillance. We watch cities at a time in order to assist law enforcement in lowering crime rates. We're essentially a Google Earth Live with TiVo capability that allows us to follow people to and from crime scenes.
Here's how it works. Ross and his team listen to emergency calls and police scanners to find the time and place of reported crimes. They go to the live feed that their plane is sending down and start to scroll back and forth through time to actually see the crime take place.
So right here, you can actually see two cars that match the description from the 911 calls. The cars leave the scene here, and we're going to try to follow those cars and see if we can find a final location that they go to. And we'll also follow them backwards in time to see if we can figure out where they came from.
This scary technology, which is also used to create 3D representations of Boston and has been facilitated by the 5G network, has now been twice shut down by the ACLU, who has pursued legal recourse to take these systems offline, the first time in 2016 and then more recently in 2020. And as 5G comes online and the data can be more easily passed to the cloud, I would argue that we need regulations for how these devices are used. And while Baltimore's project has been shut down just recently, in places like Kansas City, they are already deploying these drones to do the same thing right now. Regulations for new technologies often lag far behind. Take, for example, GPS tracking. And while GPS technology has been around and widely available since the early 90s, using them to track people in a criminal investigation just recently became illegal without a search warrant. I would argue that we really need to consider all the potential, both good and bad, that 5G technology offers us and how we as architects, designers, and engineers, urban planners use these systems, and what ethics do we bring to bear? What potentials do they hold for us? So hopefully I will pass it over to our amazing speakers to enlighten us on some of these issues. First, we have John Monchaux. John Monchaux is a professor and head of the architecture department at MIT, as well as partner in the architectural practice Modem. He is author of Spacesuit, Fashioning Apollo, which was released by MIT Press in 2011, and Local Code, 3,659 proposals about data, design, and nature of cities by Princeton Architectural Press in 2016. Sheila Kennedy is an American architect, innovator, and educator. She is a professor of architecture at MIT and a founding principal of KVA Maddox, an interdisciplinary practice that is recognized for the innovation in architectural material research and the design of new resilient infrastructure for emerging public need. Her work in design research examines intersections between natural ecologies and hybrid high and low technologies in network cities and urbanizing global regions impacted by climate change. We have Luca Carlone, assistant professor in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Dr. Carlone directs the MIT Spark Lab, which works at the cutting edge of robotics and autonomous systems research. His research into geometric computer vision applied to sensing, perception, and decision-making in robot systems yields expertise at the confluence of 3D and 5G. Brad Samuels is a founding partner at C2 and the director of C2 Research, an organization that merges data and design to create new pathways for justice. Outside the multidisciplinary practice, Brad sits on the Technology Advisory Board for the International Criminal Court, the Advisory Board for the Carnegie Mellon Center of Human Rights Science, the Advisory Board for Dartmouth's Rice Center for the Study of Computation and Just Communities, and the board of the Architecture League of New York. He is a fellow with the Urban Design Forum and teaches in Barnard College and Columbia University undergraduate architecture program. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. I will pass it over to Nicholas Monchaux. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Very happy to be here with you all tonight. I'm looking at the list of names. I think they, I would emphasize that they probably go in ascending, potentially ascending order of actual expertise on the technologies of 5G networking, as well as drone aviation and all the rest. My own background in recent years, I came to MIT from UC Berkeley, where I was for several years director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, where we thought and still think a lot interdisciplinarily about the nature of contemporary technologies and their effects on ideas and even the university itself. So with that, I'll explain the perspective of my provocation, as I was asked to share with you, and then we will take it from there. Yes, okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. So this is a colorized version of exactly the same class of image that Sarah was showing you, a Google autonomous vehicle point cloud. And again, to emphasize my own take on this, I'm not so much an expert in the underlying technologies, but certainly a participant in a whole set of conversations over the years, thinking about the relationship between information and the city and society. The two are, of course, inextricable. And with a slight warning of probably the most disturbing image I'm going to show this evening, which is this image of the recent Capitol Hill insurrection, is one that can't be far from the mind of anyone really thinking about the intersection of contemporary data and society and physical space. This is, of course, a different kind of conflation than one we're talking about, but not unrelated, in that it's on the one hand, a physical manifestation of a massive online data-driven phenomenon of social media, the tendencies and innate proclivities of data-driven media to amplify difference, and the physical space of the city, in this case, in a particularly violent and disturbing way. We see on the screen here Thomas Fee of Freeport, New York. He himself was arrested later, rightfully so, because he texted this image to his brother-in-law, a federal agent, revealing the fact that we also still somehow think what happens in virtual space and physical space aren't related, and yet our world is ever more defined by that intersection and the intersection of it with physical society. It's of course, coming off of the sedition and the Capitol Hill invasion of data on January 6th was a massive, was a 140,000 image data set put together by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and a one-day 26% spike in the use of the app Clearview, now very well-known little startup that has scraped 3 billion images from Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and others, reminding us, of course, of the old saw of the study of social media in its early ages, which is that if you aren't paying for a service, you are the product. So from that slightly tendentious initial thought comes a couple of subsequent thoughts about the nature of the relationship between data and cities themselves, and what this massive increase of information is likely to mean in terms of a massive increase of all kinds of urban phenomena and civic phenomena that we associate with the proliferation of data and data about us in particular. This is an image I like of what was the nascent, but now no longer anything at all, effort by Google's Alphabet's division, Sidewalk Labs, to build a massive new neighborhood in Toronto. This was the sort of visitor center, and behind it is probably a not coincidentally placed Apple billboard that says, if you can't read it, we're in the business of staying out of yours. One of the massive investment by Sidewalk Labs in the end, a fairly inoffensively innovative architectural proposal was ultimately undercut in the local politics of Toronto by a lack of trust in Google's data handling of the data produced by residents of this new development, which would have a massive 5G enabled data collection, would have had a massive 5G enabled data collection infrastructure designed to improve quality of life, leading to the sort of civic data trust and ideas that were, in the end, unconvincing. Of course, that's all a bit distracting because what we're not probably at risk of is massive Google-built housing developments in our cities, but rather at the convergence of social media, 3D technology, 5G networking, in conflating in a less dramatic and alarming way the space of social media, data and media about us, and the physical fabric of the city. In fact, in an even less dramatic way, it's already happening with things that you're not likely to have opted out of when you log into certain apps on your mobile phone. The last thought that I would bring you with, to zoom way out, but hopefully before all the rest of our speakers zoom way back in, is what I think should be a particularly interesting concern, but no less urgent when it comes to this geometric proliferation of data and our own experience of the city, which is its threat to, of all things, anonymity. Not that I wish the invaders of the US Capitol to be anonymous, but the history of the city and its mode and the history of its identity as a space for innovation has relied extensively on it. I think it's worth pointing out. This is a famous essay by Evgeny Mozorov lamenting the end of the so-called cyberflaneur, the age of the internet, ending in about 2012, when it was all about wandering around places that didn't know who you were and exactly what you were doing there. And this, ironically, is a very different, earlier form of media, a typewritten letter by Jane Jacobs, where she makes the case for this kind of anonymity in her own pitch to Chad Bowen Gilpatrick of the Rockefeller Foundation for the manuscript that would become The Death of Life of Great American Cities, where she emphasizes the loose and anonymous connections between members of a shared society in the city as one of the sustaining elements of civic space. When 19th century sociologists like Durkheim and Simmel wrote about the city, they connected the anonymity of the city to the experience of depression in it. But what we've learned from urban studies after this fact is, in fact, in established urban societies in particular, mental health is higher in cities and is tied precisely to our ability to take on and enact multiple separate identities in multiple contexts, as well as to be part of an anonymous whole. Now, of course, social media, by contrast, has been linked to depression for its ability to keep us in a single endless scroll or feed of information, which has its own, of course, ambient effects of the city in our tendency to shop online and to have effects even on the spaces of sidewalks. But for myself, again, as a thinker about media in the city, first and foremost, I think one of the most hopeful and troubling questions is, what will a massively increased amount of information about who, what, and where we are in the context of the city do to the city's unique and essential balance of chaos and order? Out of it is both the sort of dystopic possibility that these two will become ever more enmeshed, and the rules of social media space will ever more be the rules of the city, but also potentially a hopeful prospect that we will start to truly understand and push back at the bargains we've made in one set of spaces when they start to encroach on spaces which we are more likely to see ourselves as civically occupying. So that is the provocation I have to share to start us off, and I look forward to handing over to our next participant. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. A lot to talk about later. Now I want to pass it to Luca.
My name is Luca Carlone, and I'm the director of the Sensing, Perception, Autonomy, and Robot Kinetics Lab at MIT. My lab is working on developing intelligence and autonomous navigation capabilities for mobile platforms. For instance, we design algorithms that the drone can use to build a 3D map of the environment in real time. Using this map, the drone can avoid obstacles, can perform inspection, or support search and rescue operations. We also work on the algorithms that enable a self-driving car to identify the traversable space, to track other vehicles, and recognize traffic lights and traffic signs. And in general, my students and postdoc work on the design of autonomous navigation capabilities for a broad range of platforms and applications, ranging from autonomous exploration with a Boston Dynamics Spot robot, as the one that you see on the left, to object transportation with a drone, as the one that you see on the right. So for those of you not working on these topics, you must know that we are living in a time of unprecedented progress and opportunities. Unmanned aerial systems, what we typically call drones, are becoming increasingly popular. And indeed, back in 2016, the number of drones registered with the Federal Aviation Administration was already larger than the number of registered airplanes. Today, we have around 1 million registered drones only in the United States. Advances in algorithms, computing, and sensing have allowed the development of drones that are extremely easy to operate. For instance, this is a video from a company I love, which is called Skydio. Here, the user can simply switch on the drone and have the drone record their favorite training session while flying autonomously and avoiding obstacles. And this is a drone that you can buy. Actually, you can buy the newer version of this drone for less than $2,000. These drones include multiple cameras and have an onboard computer. And thanks to the advances in photogrammetry and AI, they're able to build a 3D map in real time, and they can detect and track humans in real time. With some post-processing, they can also build a more accurate 3D reconstruction of the area that they explored. Now, while few research labs and companies such as Skydio are developing autonomous drones, the truth is that the vast majority of drones are currently operated by human pilots. The pilot issues commands to the drone, essentially to tell it in which direction it has to move. At the same time, the drone can send sensor and status information back to the user, including image streams or position information. And this is where 5G communication comes into play. 5G is the 5th generation technology standard for broadband cellular networks. It was already introduced in 2016 and started being widely deployed in 2019. 5G is designed to enable much faster Wi-Fi speeds, and in particular, it allows download speeds up to 10 gigabit per second, which is comparable with what you get with cable internet. This is roughly 20 times faster than the current 4G technology we have on our phones. Moreover, 5G allows lower latencies, reducing the time it takes for the signal to be transmitted from the drone to the user, and is able to reduce this time from 20-30 milliseconds, which is what you could get with 4G, to less than 10 milliseconds with 5G. This has the potential to allow drones to send more and higher resolution data while also allowing a more frequent control of the drone itself. This also means that we can move some of the computation out of the drone and simply just deploy smaller platforms. Another important aspect of 5G is that it enables more devices to connect to the internet. While 5G allowed few thousands of devices per square mile, 5G can support millions of devices per square mile. Well, at this point, many of you will be thinking, why do we need drones and 5G in the first place? And the truth is that the combination of drones and 5G offers tremendous opportunities, and I'm trying to list just a few of them in this slide. 5G can enable a more effective use of drones for disaster response and search and rescue, and indeed, drones have been already used in recent disasters, including the California Camp Fires in 2018, as well as for hurricane response, including for Hurricane Harvey in 2017. In this application, drones have the potential to quickly monitor large areas. They can create a map to provide situational awareness to first responders. They can assess structural damage or even extinguish wildfires. Drones can be used for the delivery of medical goods. For instance, delivery companies such as Zipline are using drones to deliver frozen plasma and medical supply in Africa and the United States. This drone can deliver a package weighing up to 4 pounds within a 50-mile radius in less than 30 minutes. And Zipline has already delivered over 60,000 units of blood, vaccines for measles, polio, and other diseases, and is now looking into delivering COVID-19 vaccines. Drones also carry the promise of making agriculture more effective. They can monitor crops and allow early treatment of pests or pathogens, or compensate for inadequate moisture or nutrition, preventing yield loss. And this is going to be crucial since the demand for crop production is expected to double by 2050. As another application, drones can be used for real-time infrastructure inspection, ranging from bridges to pipelines and buildings. And there are simply countless applications to entertainment, from drone cinematography to enabling complex choreographies like the one during the Super Bowl halftime show in 2017, where 300 drones were used to recreate the American flag during Lady Gaga's performance. Finally, 5G can allow a fine-grained control of the location of the drones flying at any given time, potentially enabling the equivalent of the air traffic management system that's used for regular airplanes. This again is going to be important to ensure that drones are used in a safe way when they become more broadly adopted. Despite the opportunities, we have to remember that drones are a dual-use technology. Not dissimilarly from smartphone and social media, drones can be used for the benefit of society, but can also be used to invade privacy and pose security threats. As an example, back in 2018, a drone sighting caused the airport of Gatwick in the UK to close for 2 days, resulting in more than 1,000 flights being cancelled, with more than 140,000 passengers being affected. In general, if any user can operate a drone, we have to be ready to cope with malicious users who can pose security threats. Another concern is about, of course, privacy and surveillance. For instance, in 2020, China used drones and face recognition to enforce quarantine during the coronavirus outbreak, while Myanmar has recently used surveillance drone for domestic monitoring and repression. Finally, we have to remember that 5G not only allows connecting drones, but can really connect any type of device, including our smartwatch, smart appliances, our computers, our cars. It is estimated that the average person will produce 1 gigabyte of personal data per day using 5G. And the lack of regulation can lead to leaking personal and sensitive information, such as our heart rate, our location, or the food we eat. Therefore, there is a desperate need for better data governance, which can limit violation of privacy and ensure the data is used for the benefit of society while respecting individual freedom and rights. Whether it's data collected by a drone or by a mobile phone, we have to remember that data is the new oil, and scientists, users, and policymakers have to come together to ensure that data is extracted, processed, and distributed in a sustainable way and with the approval of the user.
Thanks so much, Luca. Now I will pass it to Sheila. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. Wow. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Nods? Yes. Okay, great. Yeah, that was amazing. What an amazing set of provocations from Nicholas and Luca. I have the task, I was charged by Sarah and Caroline to try to think a little bit about the kind of material backbone of this infrastructure. So I'll be presenting a set of visual notes that won't wade in so much on good and bad, possible applications for 3D, 5G, but rather the infrastructure itself. And I'll actually be arguing that although data is the new oil, it still has a lot of the old oil. You know, in thinking about 5G and its impacts on the sort of three-dimensional world, the architectural world, I'd like to begin with just some language, which you see here, with the story of early electrical technology and how that's being told. How is this story being told? One form of agency, I guess, that the discipline of architecture has is that it has a history. And so it's useful to set 3D, 5G in the context. So looking at this kind of electrical apotheosis, words like rank vegetation of the coniferous forests, that would be the oil on which data is based. We're wading through the ages. There's a sense of kind of an arc of history that is inevitably moving forward. There are a million references to a million, to genius, and to the kind of huge field of opportunity that lies ahead. And you know, there are many examples that I could have picked. This one is from Deloitte Consulting, but it just kind of looks at the language and the claims also for 5G, you know, an autonomous future, talks about smart autonomous vehicles, smart ports, smart homes, and has a lot of promises. I think the word promise is used 3 times in this piece of text. 5G can make it all happen. Again, we have the number 1 million connected devices in 1 square kilometer. There's a kind of a sense of tuning here in this language. not necessarily to civic debate or discussion, but rather kind of attuned to markets and maybe even investors. And that is, of course, a communality. Gaslighting, you know, in the 1800s, the electrical grid in the 1900s, and the internet era and 3D, 5G share language and claims. And these claims are that the technology is inevitable, that it's a march of history, and that it's a succession of superlatives, right? That gas and then electricity and then the internet are the cleanest, the most efficient, the fastest. And always these electrically based technologies were framed as being, you know, being beneficial, especially for the urban bourgeois. And it's kind of interesting when we think about drones to look at these large lighting towers and street lighting devices that also are kind of occupying what Donna Haraway has called the kind of God's eye position. So this is actually the kind of God trick, as she calls it, as Donna Haraway calls it, achieving the vantage point, she says, of the cyclopean, self-satiated eye of the master subject. The dream of a vision without limit, it uses its accumulation of information and surveillance as evidence to kind of pride itself, ironically, on its objectivity. So even in the early European urbanism, we see the kind of effect of this proto-drone-like flood of light and flood of surveillance. And of course, people like Ian Shaw in his chapter on the predator empire, and Anna Fergenbaum from cyborg feminism to drone feminism, have kind of made the connection between Haraway's God trick and the proliferation of drones, which operates with a kind of colonial logic of us in the sky versus them on the ground. And the drone kind of performs this logic through its digital worldview of targets looking down on people that dismisses ambiguity. And of course, there's always this sense that this technology, be it electricity or even 3D, 5G, is essential to life. It's intimately tied with life, with all of our devices. And this is an example of a kind of early wearable. I don't know if we should really put that one on. The smart electric bath with all of its wires plunged into the bath, that's probably not that very smart either. But examples of the kind of accoutrements and the cultural and societal embeddedness of these technologies in ways of life, in appliances, and in a whole host of kind of other products. So I want to kind of just go out there and offer a set of provocations or notes for what this might mean for the kind of agency of architecture. And I have several different ideas about different kinds of design. And there are, I think, some force multipliers that one could argue really do differentiate the impacts of 3D, 5G, factors which are distinctive in this new layering of the technology on all the others. And these do complicate the forms of agency of design and architecture with respect to this vision of infrastructure. And so I think one of them is this intensely concentrated incorporation of the 3D, 5G innovation ecology. The domination of the kind of entrepreneurial space by global mega companies that take on quasi-state-like operations, a space in which smaller, nimble innovator companies are then acquired by just a very few players. So there's an increasing concentration and kind of monopolization and incorporation of this particular infrastructure. And because of that, I think it's really important to think about this in terms of thinking about our agency as a renewed investment in constructing or reconstructing forms of collectivity or collective action with respect to this infrastructure. So I've been looking a little bit at some of the early 1980s and 1970s feminist activist events. The way in which they made symbols like this coat hanger, no coat hanger, we all understand what that means in an effort to kind of reclaim women's bodies. This is from Houston, Texas. Or the Greenham Commons Woman Peace Camp, which was a very significant anti-nuclear protest, and site for debate and discussion. Design for discourse, really trying to use the physical world in every way that we can to bring people together physically whenever we have the chance to do that. And that may be through forms of appropriation, like this do-it-yourself guide to remodeling the perimeter fence of a big nuclear compound. You have the tools, you have a gate, you use your imagination, and you make a grill for your teapot, which is a kind of a campfire around which everyone can kind of meet and locate. So I think maybe the charge is to, or the question is, can we take over every corridor? Can we take over every piece of circulation and try to make that an open space that's hackable, where people could actually meet and gather? Can we connect every space we can to nature and to natural systems? Can we actually, in architectural design, look at the physical linkages? Maybe circulation becomes much more important, ways that we physically can meet and interact with each other. The other provocation is design for disguise. And that is the idea of digital twinning that Luca spoke about. This is from the Skydio Autonomy video on YouTube that Luca hosted. And you see here a model that was a 3D model, a high quality 3D model that was produced by drone by the Skydio videos and their flight paths, and the kind of level of detail that you get. But it's not just making a map of one piece of infrastructure or all the pieces of infrastructure in a particular industrial or military complex. It's a digital twinning with a high degree of embedded information and layers. So it's virtually a whole other city that's happening. And we may need to design in, as a form of an agency, a way to actually hide or protect ourselves from this. Not only is it a digital twin city, but it's inhabited by digital people who are strikingly realistic. And this is a great example from the New York Times that shows the kind of fluidity of machine vision and artificial intelligence working together to produce these seemingly real set of characters from like 12 digital phenotypes. This is the artist Hungry, who works in Berlin. This is a recent piece from their Instagram. And what they do is they disguise themselves by mingling their countenance with that of insects and bugs. And they're known as the Bug Lady. And so the surveillance systems of the city of Berlin don't really pick up on the Bug Lady when they're out and about. We can also think about the kind of resistance of trees, the way in which there's an increase in popularity of do-it-yourself masks, and how these masks could take natural or leaf-like forms, because it's still very difficult for machine vision to capture the complexity of a leaf of a tree. So that's why we think about the resistance of trees here. This is a really interesting project that Darrell Shinseto, an MIT SMART student, did for her thesis. She looked at video capture, which you can see on the lower right, and then began to see what was slightly off frame and kept track of what she calls the scraps from a video feed. And Darrell's project shows that we ourselves are surveying ourselves with every single video that we take, our selfies, our live feeds, and so forth. And that even from those two-dimensional images, very realistic point clouds can be made. And what Darrell is proposing is the physical design of textiles that might complicate the way in which that might be reissued and recycled very quickly, but might complicate the fidelity with which machine vision recognizes it. So she imagined a series of these drapes going over beds and couches and so forth, so that people would be less able to invade your privacy and offer you kind of predictive marketing suggestions and build a profile on you. Just changing just a little bit from this kind of adversarial interior to maybe adversarial exteriors, I don't know. But you know, it's amazing how many books there are on rammed earth, and we have to think, is this solidity, is this earth, which actually does tamper and distort a little bit the electromagnetic waves and the parts of the spectrum where 3D 5G operates, is this enjoying a new popularity? Will we actually go to the thickness of Earth and kind of revive these ancient materials to try to afford us a little bit of privacy? The third is design for sharing economies. This has to do, again, with Skydio's language, which is shown here in 4 or 5 stages. They call it the arc of autonomy. But I think what we want to look at is the kind of last stage, which proposes a network of drones that really is not sovereign, although we may go there, but quasi-autonomous and able to operate as an infrastructure that is a service that people might be able to kind of commission. How do we share in such an economy? Is this even about sharing? At the MIT Media Lab, Joy Bulamwini has done her encoding project, which is inclusive coding, and her team discovered that she could not be seen by some surveillance systems because machine learning uses synthetic environments, as Luca demonstrated. They're part of this digital twin to practice, and those synthetic environments are flooded with not a diversity of human beings. So there's an incredible amount of bias, Joy argues, in the system. And so in order to be seen by the system, she actually has to mask herself with a white mask. So this is a form of identifying a blind spot in that kind of social sharing, or what is claimed to be a social sharing. You could also think about temporal sharing, just-in-time rooms, just-in-time apartments, thinking about plans in architecture, not as static, but as temporal, as needing to change with real-time information, like peer-to-peer energy sharing, groups of people who are going on vacation. You may move to another apartment, you may move to another room, and we may need to build far less physically because of the kind of sharing that's possible. And then the last provocation I have is design for caring, or infrastructures of care. And this really gets to the kind of question, and I think the imperative to create an agency for design that supports the care of the critical zone itself, the critical zone on Earth. So if we think about the amount of building debris that gets wasted, this is a giant pile of concrete rubble, and we think about the carbon investment in rubble. It's possible that if we treated these rubble with the kind of care that we treat consumer packages and tracked the rubble, instead of tracking packages, we could have an entirely different architecture, because each piece could be tagged, as we see here in the work of Tim Cousin from the MARC program at MIT. Each piece of rubble could be tagged, could be optimized, and could be used to actually create new architectural structures if we had that kind of embedded intelligence. And the same is true for our forests. We could imagine forest libraries, curated forests, where trees could be digitally replicated through scanning, which is already happening today. Whole Trees is a company that is doing this already. And we could imagine a forest that's curated so that each tree could be taken out when needed and could be used for its own form. We would not need to invest with standardization, milling, and all of those energetic expenditures that are associated with that. So it would be a whole other kind of set of renewable materials that might become part, or more firmly a part, of architectural material culture. I want to end with a little bit of the fusion of the entanglement of the kind of the natural and 5G, the drone. This is a apothecary in the 1800s, Herr Neubronner. And he had the idea that he would attach an aluminum camera to a pigeon. And so we get from Neubronner's literally bird's eye views. Some of the first bird's eye views in the early part of World War I, these strange kind of views, and, kind of like this one, it's like you see these pigeons and they have their apparatus, they fly about, and they don't care about following the person perfectly. This is literally a bird's eye view. They're going to into the roost. They don't care if the frame is constantly tilted or it's not self-leveling. So I want to think then about the physical materiality, right? If you're not a bird and if you are a drone, you need a battery. And that turns out to be a fairly significant battery. There are different kinds of teardowns online that we can find. Here's one for the iPhone 12. Here's a review of the Skydio S2 drone battery. It has something like 21 minutes of flying time. And it also has a 3000 milliamp battery, which is about 11 watts. So sort of taken together, if we do the numbers, we have sort of 75 watts here with the wall charger for the Skydio batteries, there are two, and then the iPhone that might be attached also to the drone. And if we think about that 75 watts and we go up to the density that has been discussed of 1 million devices per square kilometer, and then we think about the size of New York, which is about 300 square kilometers, we get to a lot of power. We get to about 22.5 gigawatts of power. And the Department of Energy tells us that that is equivalent to about over 10,000 wind farms, which are based on a utility scale turbine of about 2.4 megawatts. It would be the equivalent of over 6,750,000 homes as of 2017. So you'd be able to power a lot if New York City got its promise of a dense drone network in the arc of autonomy. I'm going to close now talking a little bit about lithium, because we were just talking about batteries and about extraction and about infrastructures of care. And so we have to kind of rethink how we actually get uranium. I'm sorry, uranium, yes, but also lithium in this case. The lithium triangle in Peru and Bolivia is where 40% of the world's lithium is found. It's an extremely extractive process in a drought-ridden area in South America, and it uses about 500,000 gallons of water, per a very small amount of lithium processed for batteries. So I'm going to show you some images of that process, and I'm just going to stop my share for one brief moment while I cue something up for you, and then I'll just close it out this way. I actually, yeah, okay, great. I actually dug up a digital remastering of a song, so I thought that might be a good way to kind of end this.
Sorrows come and go. Now we see the human race has put its foot.
Thanks so much, Sheila, and thanks for ending us off with some music. I'll now turn to Brad Samuels from C2 Studio.
Okay, thanks. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? It says loading.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, sorry for the delay. Okay, great, thank you. So this will be more of a sort of 5G adjacent presentation as opposed to a 5G explicit one. But I think the work we've been talking about today is really going to radically change what we've been doing as an organization. We describe what we do. C2 Research merges data and design to create new pathways for justice. And most recently, what that's meant for us is really focusing on suppression of dissent
protests and excessive use of force, usually by police and state actors in public spaces. The kind of main sort of source of evidence is photographs and videos, and the proliferation of those assets is just exponentially increasing, as we all know. A lot of our work has to do with providing context. So what you see here is the Portland Police Bureau during a protest back in June. And part of what we're trying to do is kind of look beyond the frame and think about what's happening. And this is where some of the LiDAR and the laser scans and the photogrammetry comes into place, right? You know, there's the kind of question of, you know, what's the context for what's captured in that small vantage? There's also the fact that there's just unbelievable amounts of documentation, and that's only increasing, right? And so this is a small snapshot of a protest that took place in the Bronx on June 4th that we worked on, that I'll show you some more about. And it's a, you know, on the one hand, you know, citizen documentation provides a lot of evidentiary material to kind of get to the sort of crux of what happened. It also provides a huge volume of assets to even try and comb through, right? But the main goal here is to kind of cut through the competing narratives and try and establish a baseline understanding of a complex event. The fact that protests are often complex events, or often called chaotic events, provides a lot of semantic cover for those who actually aren't that interested in accountability, right? But the point is, different tools, different methods, different techniques can be leveraged to kind of cut through the noise, whether that's trying to better understand activity of federal forces showing up in Portland in July, or it's insurrectionists at the Capitol. A lot of the same questions, same methods, same tools, same technologies. And interestingly for us, a lot of our work in this field, looking at sort of the relationship between urban space and protests, was done everywhere but the United States to begin with. So that what you just saw was in Iraq, protesters on a bridge in Baghdad being fired at tear gas canisters at low angle, or here in Hong Kong, looking at high volumes of tear gas being deployed against protesters. This is work that both cases we did with Amnesty International, but again, combining 3D environments, photographic information to try and provide a coherent and clear understanding of these events, and kind of bring your attention to the core legal or advocacy question. And I'm going to talk about one advocacy case and one legal case. The irony is not lost on us. Everything we've been doing had been everywhere else but the US. Following the murder of George Floyd, we pivoted really hard to take these same tools and apply them not only domestically, but to retool them so they didn't take 6 months or a year to actually do the casework. I mean, you know, so we could really address the kind of structural and systemic issues that were happening across the United States. And so I'm going to show two cases where that work was done domestically. Again, one advocacy, the other legal. And those are distinctions which sometimes productively are blurred. A bit about the tools and methods. You know, sometimes we have the benefit of really high resolution 3D LiDAR, sometimes we don't. This is the case in the Bronx where we had just open city data, so sort of simple massing models of the city, but here looking to locate vantage points, points of capture of videos documenting the same moment in time, right, in space. Time syncing videos, the metadata is often unreliable, but often we have CCTV footage, and then we can begin to kind of sync other footage up to it and figure out what videos might have captured the same moment in time among the thousands that might be available. This is a ton of work, and just kind of this heavy lifting at the beginning cuts into the time we can actually spend analyzing events. But you know, this is an example. Flashbang grenade goes off, captured in a number of different videos. One of them is time-stamped and ground truthed. We then have a sense of where both locally, time-wise this might have occurred, and also on a global clock. So these are the kinds of cues that become very productive. Here, you know, merging and experimenting with how to extract information from these videos. This is in Charlotte, North Carolina, police firing flashbangs and tear gas against protesters in a very confined space with no egress and nowhere to go, taking everything out that we don't want to look at and leaving the model and the part of the video that really is salient, in this case, in a legal case. I'm going to go through two projects very quickly, and I want to just say at the top is a bit of a warning that some of what you'll see is violent. It's not really intensely graphic, but there's some violence that I'm going to be showing you. The first case is one we did, like I said, in the Bronx, looking at a tactic called kettling that the NYPD has used and used in this case. There's a group called FTP4, which had organized a rally in the Mott Haven neighborhood of the Bronx. And it was really not just the tactic of kettling, but the confluence of this tactic with de Blasio's curfew and the urban environment that needed to be understood synthetically, right? And this is kind of all coming together in this analysis. I'm going to play a short video. And I want to just point out at the beginning that, you know, FTP4 organized this rally. De Blasio's rhetoric in the months and weeks, the weeks and months that followed was that the protesters were violent. The tactic was justified. And really, this work is about kind of unpacking those claims and holding the mayor and the police accountable for those statements. I want to play a quick video. This is a project we did with Human Rights Watch.
As the marchers headed down Willis Avenue, more than 50 police officers blocked the street.
Yo, we gonna go around. We gonna go around.
The march redirected down 136th Street. And in the final minutes, just before the 8 o'clock curfew, instead of allowing or even directing the marchers to disperse, the NYPD diverted its bicycle officers to block the marchers just as they reached the intersection of 136th and Brook Avenue. And from behind the march, a line of officers blocked the protesters from turning back. It's a tactic called kettling.
So, you know, it's the basic idea is that we have the same event captured from multiple perspectives. And with 5G, that's only going to, you know, increasingly be so. And it's really about understanding what this kettle looks like from above, what it looks like on the ground, and sort of looking at it and measuring it in relation to what the official narrative actually is, right? And I want to just compare, and that was an advocacy case. That was not meant for court. It's meant to put pressure on accountability, right, and redress. This is a case that was for court and a kind of gold standard for us in terms of capture. Here you have a photogrammetric scan of an entire urban area from a drone that's combined with a series of laser scans on the ground, so we can get really high fidelity both on vertical surfaces and everything you might want from a photogrammetric perspective. But it provides very, very high resolution information and allows us to kind of take apart the digital model. And I'll try and move through this quite quickly. But isolating features of interest. And in a legal case, it becomes very myopic very quickly and somewhat absurdly, but we may be interested in one very small and very specific question depending on who the plaintiff is. In this case, the plaintiff was a group called Don't Shoot Portland. These folks who organized the protest, and we were working with them and we were working with the legal team. They filed a case, you know, arguing that the use of force by the Portland Police Bureau was excessive. And used one event to a series of events in one evening to try and demonstrate that point. And I'll show very quickly. I think I'm going to do it without sound. We had to build a tool that was basically not a video, not an advocacy video, a linear video like you just saw that was used for the Human Rights Watch case, but something you could click on. The lawyers could kind of advance to different places. The defense could query, the prosecution could query, et cetera. So much more dynamic and interactive format for court. But this is the end product, a kind of combination of that high fidelity laser scan with video footage, which documents very specific incidents. And really the question in the legal context is, what was the 30 seconds or 60 seconds that led to this sort of use of force or moment of violence? That is what has to get unpacked in a very granular, very myopic way. And we do this through 9 events in this case, some of which also kind of leverage the digital model and the high fidelity nature of it to do kind of a quantitative analysis. You know, in this case, you're getting direction from the Portland Police Bureau, move east. You can see that this protester is moving east, he's complying. At the same time, a flashbang grenade is thrown directly at him and he's injured, right? So how do we get to the very specific nature of the question when you're talking about crowds? And again, the kind of conceit of complexity becomes something to hide behind. And I just want to close in terms of the impact of this work. I think both of these cases, we feel like move the needle a little bit. In the Portland case, the judge held the Portland police in contempt of Don't Shoot Portland's case. And in the New York case, there was a lot of pressure on de Blasio and others to answer for what they had been saying.
On what happened in May and June, and I look back with remorse. I wish I had done better. I want everyone to understand that. And I'm sorry I didn't do better. And I've learned a lot of valuable lessons. And I want our police department to do better.
And so just a very, very quick reflection on kind of like what's next, and I'll end here. I thought it was really interesting to see the very kind of mainstreaming of these visual investigations tools on the floor, combining diagrams, combining videos. I think this is only going to increasingly be the case. Of course, this is a double-edged sword. We're doing this because we're passionate about combating abuses of power, but it's very easy to see how these same technologies get co-opted and reversed, for, let's say, quote unquote, public safety, which is something that concerns us. And we're getting a lot of somewhat unwanted attention from people who are in that sector. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Brad. Super interesting and impactful work. And as I'm, looking at all of the presentations, something that came to mind is I was thinking about Patrick Geddes. I know this sounds like a strange old reference, but he was a Scottish biologist, sociologist, geographer, philanthropist, an urban planner. But what I always found interesting about Patrick Geddes is he really struggled to see the world and find ways to see it. He tried maps and kind of different formats, collage, and then he created his camera obscura, which is this outlook tower to look at the regional landscape. And what I felt in all of our presentations, we were really, how do we use this new technology really to see the world in different ways and kind of really make connections, both good and bad for that. Another thing that came to mind as I was looking and thinking about all the presentations is really the promise and perils of new technology. And, whenever we have a new technology, and I think Sheila's talk really helped to amplify that, right? Like even during time when we were getting electricity's kind of debate between the promise and peril of new technology. Then I have this question, how do we encourage innovation while at the same time consider the potential perils for seeing and understanding the worlds we live? So, I felt like all of us had kind of this one side where, there's a potential benefit and another where we're kind of highlighting the perils. So I kind of pass it to a very big, broad, hard question, but how do we encourage innovation, but at the same time consider the potential for it to do harm? I see Nicholas is unmuted himself.
Oh, I was unmuting myself for a shared discussion, but I'd say quickly, one of the fundamental rules of technology is unintended consequences. So to some extent, I think the mechanisms we need to develop are adaptive because of all the things that 3D, 5G and technology are going to do. I can almost guarantee you with infinite respect for all of the wisdom of my co-panelists that the most remarkable effect is one that we inherently can't understand tonight because it depends on questions of scale and scaling and implementation that we just inherently can't see. And it's in the nature of complex systems like cities that once they get to a certain scale and certain size, they behave in ways that we fundamentally don't anticipate. So that's precisely not an answer to your question, Sarah, but I
It's
think
a hard question. I mean, I think it's the age-old
Yeah.
question, as you point out, that we're, as we're always thinking about. And, like technology is a double-edged sword, but as most things in the world, right, it's a medium that can convey messages, good and bad, which you point out.
It's a great question. I certainly don't have an answer for it, but I think that in a place like MIT, and certainly in educational institutions, I think the question of the sort of incorporation of innovation and the ecology of innovation is really a challenge. And can we, are there mechanisms, whether those be governmental or policy, to bring corporations to a sense of a common good, maybe even a common planetary good rather than a corporate good? Because I think that is a defining characteristic, the increasing privatization of infrastructure service providers, certainly in the internet and social media space, that do operate as quasi-states, as we saw with the banning on Twitter and so forth.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think in our practice, it's hard for those things to kind of live in exactly the same place. Like, with human rights work, often you don't really have a chance to get it wrong, right? There's the kind of do no harm model. And that can also produce a chilling effect on how we think about innovation and some of the new tools. And so I think what's been most productive for us is to have very robust, very active conversations between people who are experts in the peril side of things and people who are pushing hard on some of the ways in which it helps with accountability and redress and the positive side of things. And for those conversations to be robust and continuous, forums like this, I think, are very productive. But I personally find it nearly impossible to reconcile those two things within one house, within one brain. They often live separately and in discourse.
Just want to maybe to remark on the role of the user for essentially accepting or rejecting innovations, right? If you think about consumer products, at the end of the day, it's partially on the user to decide which technology is good or bad, right? And if I like the iPhone, I will use the iPhone. If I like another phone, I will just reward a different innovation instead of the iPhone. I think the problem that you are facing here is that the user is no longer provided with the information which is needed to decide, right? I'm giving my data, I'm giving up my data because I'm using social media, but I'm not aware of that entirely, right? So I think the first step, making sure that we can empower the user, and the user in turn can just prioritize the right type of innovation which is beneficial for society, is just to provide information to make sure that the user is informed. That's the bit I wanted to add.
I guess I would dive in there because it relates actually to an interesting internal MIT question, which is this one we're having at the moment around the role of conversations about design across the Institute. And so when it comes to a lot of, and here I'm relating to my context in the Bay Area, particularly in the discourses around design in Silicon Valley, so much faith is placed in the user. The user is at the center of user-centric design, and the user and so much time and energy is spent on the micro scale of features that smooth and improve our lived experience. But there's a difference between a user-centric design and civic-centric design. I think this relates to Sarah's agenda and Sarah's work. And one of I can say, as someone who helped develop the joint design degree between the College of Environmental Design and the College of Engineering at UC Berkeley over the last several years. One of the interesting differences in cultural understandings between user-centric design and architecturally inflected design, not to diminish one or the other, but one has a clear narrative and a clear mode of exit, or a seemingly clear mode of exit. If I don't like the phone, I buy another phone. If I don't like the drone, I buy another drone. That there's a kind of level of agency and autonomy that's assumed. But I often explain the differences in design culture between architecture and certainly some user-centric designers that I encountered in that context by explaining that an architect, well, the person who, a phone is relatively straightforward, or we think it's relatively straightforward, because the person who pays for it is the same as the person who uses it, who is the same as the person who has the power to get rid of it. Whereas a building, for example, the person who pays for it is often not the person who occupies it, is often not the person who has to live with it or in it, either literally from day one or across the street, you know, for the 20 years later. And so there's inherently, I wish this was more explicit in architectural ethics, a kind of Hippocratic-esque at least imperative to not just give the person who's paying for the thing what they want, but also to think about the larger consequences. And this comes into play when a technology that's designed as a consumer technology, like the Facebook Infinite Scroll, which is very beautiful, has an amazing UX designer behind it, has incredible civic consequences, most of which weren't imagined or unintended, in terms of the need to continuously capture attention, to drive clicks and advertising fees, and therefore give people things that amplify their own views, et cetera, et cetera. And I wasn't the only one who showed the Capitol insurrection this evening. So I know this is not what you were saying, Luca, but I think this this 3D 5G context is yet another, and yet a very architecturally scaled convergence of different cultures of design, which from the civic scale, from the urban scale and planning scale to the consumer scale, and an illustration of why we have to build the culture and conversations of design, as we're trying to right now at MIT, that go across those scales and communicate between them, not just as cultures of objects, but also as cultures of designers.
I think there's a number of questions, and I'm going to tie them together regarding, what is the difference between having drone technology or say overhead surveillance versus the CCTV, or, what is the difference between introducing this technology from other kinds of technology that already exists, that we kind of live with already, I guess, is the implied here. So I'll open it up. I definitely have thoughts, but I really want to hear from the panel on that.
Well, I would just say I tried to touch a little bit on that, but certainly two of them are this the fact that this technology is being the innovation ecology within this technology is being bought up by very few companies, so it's tending towards a monopoly. I think that's one kind of differentiator, and I think that I'm sorry, Sarah, what was the second part of your question? Or
people were just wondering, what is the difference between using
I would have to say
versus drone data. Yeah,
I would say the synthetic environment of the twinning and the data embedment in that is really also just kind of a remarkable phenomenon, that everything that exists sort of in the physical city can be copied and with a high degree of fidelity, even populated with artificial people and other things. And we speak about this as a kind of post-truth moment, but I wonder whether the kind of ground truth records of the kind that Brad works with are themselves subject to threat, right? To manipulation on the digital level in the digital twin.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to put my ethics hat on, just because I teach a data ethics class, and I would say, people who study data ethics, what they would say the difference between the CCTV versus the drone imagery is, let's say, the implication of being in the public realm, right? So this idea that when we are being served, and I'm just going to legal kind of perspective here, but the idea that if you are in the public realm, you're viewed, that you are aware that these devices are watching you, that there's some implication and awareness of the fact that you are being recorded. In the cases of drone, you are completely unaware that you are being surveilled, that you have the feeling as though you're in a private space, even though you are outside, maybe in your own backyard. And so it's this, let's say, kind of informed consent or kind of implicit consent of being watched that is applied in these cases, and what some of the ACLU is arguing against. So to help with that. Perhaps I'll go on to some other questions here that we have in the chat. I think another one comes up is regulation, and this idea of how do we regulate this new technology? Should we regulate it? What are who is responsible for regulating it? And I feel like, Luca, you've been called out on this one, but I think others probably have questions to ask here. And this gets back to legal kind of implications of some of this technology.
Yeah, it's a complex question because, you know, on the regulation side, there are the aspects about regulation for flying drones, and there are, of course, aspects about collecting data and taking pictures with drones. Maybe I'm more qualified to cover the first part, which is what is typically, like, you know, what are the typical rules that you apply when flying drones. And I will start by saying that things are moving very fast. You guys realize that the industry itself, the amount of adoption is increasing and it's changing very quickly. And the institutions are simply trying to keep up, like, you know, with these new devices, with this new level of adoption. So FAA, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, is in charge of establishing regulation for drones. And there is what is called Part 107, which is the part of the Federal Code of Regulation, which is ruling on where you can fly, who can fly drones, which type of drones, and so on. And this kind of regulation is just specific to kind of small drones. Small drones are 55 pounds or so, or less than that. And just to summarize what's feasible, what is typically, like, you know, what you have to be careful about. So the drones need to be registered. You need to register with the FAA to make sure that before you fly, you need to get a remote pilot certificate that has to be renewed every couple of years, and you must be at least 16 years old to get the certificate. And there are many other constraints. For example, you cannot, of course, fly everywhere. There are 6 classes of airspace. In some of them, what is called Class G, you can just fly it, you know, without authorization. In the other classes, for example, close to airports and so on, you have to ask for an authorization to the FAA. In all cases, you have to fly just below 400 feet, just because you do not have to interfere with the airplanes and things like that. Limits on speed, weight, and things that you can put on the drone. And till a month ago, there were also regulations about flying during the daytime and don't fly over people, which is probably relevant for this discussion. There was also, I think, one of the most important parts of the regulation is that when you want to fly a drone, first of all, you can operate one drone at a time, and you have to keep the drone within line of sight. You cannot fly the drone beyond, like, you know, your field of view as a pilot. Couple of extra things, maybe. First of all, things are moving quickly. I mentioned that the usual regulation was constraining the use of drones during the daytime and was preventing to fly over people. But actually, as of this month, there was a new rule coming into play, which says that you can fly it at night, actually, as long as you have lights on the drone, and you can fly over people as well. That is true for sparse group of people, it's not true for assembly of people. And I think there are rules which are mostly common sense. Like, you know, if you want to fly over people, you have to make sure that the drone is light enough that if it falls on people, does not cause damage. Okay, so there are a bunch of things which are really, like, you know, common sense. The last thing I want to mention about regulations. So you understand there are a bunch of constraints. You have to get a license, you have to understand where to fly, and there are websites that are telling you where you can fly. You have to register your drone and so on. The last thing I want to mention is that FAA is in a process of adjusting to the technology. So it's typically very easy to get waivers on some of these restrictions just because they don't want to block the industry, like, you know, while it's evolving. So these are general guidelines and there are rules, regulation that they enforce. But at the same time, you can ask for a waiver and just try to adjust these constraints to your application.
Thanks so much for thinking about the regulation. I was just thinking, trying to connect it to some of the other work that, there are a lot of, let's say, legal ways that we can use it, and how do we use these for advocacy? So we've talked about the surveillance aspects of things, but thinking about the legal use of some of this work for advocacy potentially. Right, we spoke about the surveillance aspects of things.
I mean, I can comment on that a little bit. I mean, I think the aspirational side of some of what we're doing is not just redress and accountability for things that have happened in the past, but it's really about like moving the needle on like the culture of impunity that we see in law enforcement in general. And it is, of course, a double-edged sword where, documentation, constant surveillance is scary in a lot of ways. But if the police know they're being watched, they may behave differently. Tactics may change. Use of force may change. And I think we're at a bit of a tipping point with that over the past 9 months, where I think the police will think twice before deploying, munitions in certain ways. And so there's limits to that promise, I think, and it's a bit of a game of cat and mouse. But that is just to point out that it's both about kind of like accountability and reconciling past events, but also structuring future behavior.
Sheila, you're on mute.
To Vijay's comment, just very briefly, because I think others can also respond. I think we've assumed in these talks that 5G is ubiquitous, but of course there are many parts of the world that don't have internet coverage, that don't have electricity. So certainly, those could be seen as undergrounds in that those areas are harder to be tracked, harder to be found. And so I think that these disguises are kind of double-edged swords. You can go silent and not use the technology, or you can appropriate it and use it for your own purposes to send stories that wouldn't have been told out to other parts of the world, from that. And I think in our video that we'll see at the end of the session, we may see some of that.
Great, and thank you, Sheila, for getting Vijay's question out there, because it's super, super interesting to think about, how to think about these underground technology, or how it goes underground. So I think with that, we're coming towards the end, and I'll pass it to Caroline to close us off. And thanks so much for all your thoughtful reflection today. And well, I'm sure we'll see many, many more innovations coming once this 5G technology is online, for new ways of seeing the world, I hope. Ways that we use for good and not evil, but I'll pass it back to Caroline.
Sarah, thank you so much for a really great job of moderating really complex questions coming from engineering, what capitalism is throwing our way, and of course our own design interests. I just want to throw out one final question, because it's from my very dear colleague, Shada Zaman, who asks us, is intent important in relation to privacy and the use of publicly available data? In other words, he wants to compare what Situate does to what Clearview does, and have us just think, as we conclude this event, about what is bad and good use of data and who decides that ethical question. Ultimately, I would just suggest that it's our job as citizens to make those decisions collectively, in public, and as transparently as possible. So this event is a beginning of that conversation for me. These are technologies I don't know enough about. So I'm really grateful to our panelists for setting that point in view. And to Vijay's question about where do we hide, I will pose that question in relation to the video, the remarkable video we're about to see from Lawrence Abu Hamdan. And Lawrence's position, if I may just speak for him, which is he's not exactly authorized me to do, but I admire his work very much. His position would be, we are there, we are in the surveillant web. We need to be aware of the listening and the looking that is being done. And we have agency to look back and to listen back. So his provocation around a project he has for forensic acoustics is truly remarkable and provocative and artistic. And I hope you enjoy it a lot. If you have questions and comments for us, this video will be available, eventually captioned on the architecture and on the eventual Transmedia website. And if you have questions, please just find me at MIT, Caroline Jones, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you all so much for coming, and enjoy Lawrence Abu Hamdan's interesting provocation. Thank you so much to all the panelists. You were just fantastic. I hope we can meet again in less COVID times.
The advent of digital audio allowed for the development of a technique of audio analysis in Romania by Dr. Cătălin Grigoris, now Professor of Audio Forensics in the University of Colorado. In 1991, Grigoris was working to enhance the audio quality of analog tape recordings, and this was for legal use. It involved him stripping them of noise and cleaning them with the frequency filters so that the central subject of the recording, usually a wiretapped voice, could be heard. Often his recordings would be filled with mains hum, the buzzing sound of electrical interference, technically known as ENF, electrical network frequency. His initial attempts to filter these sounds out by applying a filter at 50 Hz, the frequency at which the electricity buzzed, were unsuccessful. Small electrical noises still penetrated the recordings randomly between 49 and 51 Hz. In February 2014, I conducted a telephone interview with Grigoris in which he explained, "This is how first all I found the ENF is not 50 Hz. It's something random around 50 Hz. I built in the lab an adaptive noise filter. This was able to follow and detect the real ENF and subtract it from the recording. The idea that ENF is something random, not predictable, was clear somewhere in my mind." The adaptive noise filter that Grigoris built to clean this oscillating electrical noise off a recording was also by necessity mapping the random fluctuations of this buzz. In the days of analog recordings, this song of electricity was meaningless noise, as the technical moving parts of the tape recorder moved at a fluctuating, unsmooth speed, and so meant that each machine added to that oscillating electrical noise its own small variations in pitch. However, given that digital recording relies not on mechanical circuits, but rather encodes audio into a sequence of symbols, the pattern of oscillation of the electricity buzz was captured without the extra speed fluctuations and distortions added by the analog machine. Therefore, any two digital recorders, regardless of their brand, size, and voltage, would record the buzz in almost exactly the same way, so that two digital recordings made at the same time but at two different locations on the same electricity grid would both have the exact same random pattern of oscillation of electrical hum. Grigoris theoretically derived that because the pattern of fluctuation is so random, and the probability of that same pattern repeating over a 10-second period of audio is so unlikely, then by listening to the buzz of a digital audio recording, it should be possible to deduce exactly when it was made. Grigoris developed a system for the better eradication of unwanted noise, and while getting to know that noise closely in order to eradicate it, he understood that it was not noise at all, but rather legible sound. By zooming into the background of an audio recording and situating himself at the threshold of sonic experience, Grigoris, and by extension forensic listening as a field, eradicates noise as a sonic concept, but not as a sonic artifact. Forensic listening engages with material realities of noise and refuses, as John Cage refused silence, noise in its socio-political conception, as excess or unwanted signal. Many inventions and attempts have been made to eradicate pervasive electrical buzz since the dawn of technological audio reproducibility. Mains buzz epitomizes unwanted noise and is an infrastructural sound that our ears are used to filtering out on a daily basis. Yet in attempting to eradicate ENF with his adaptive noise filter, by listening closely to it, Gregorius realized that the electricity was not in fact making noise, but rather singing. The melody of this buzz did not follow the logic of a musical motif, but rather its strange song was almost never repeating itself. This total unpredictability, each 5-second phrase unique to the next, paradoxically made it easier to decipher as a unique timestamp. Gregorius' theory that the electricity buzz could work as a kind of digital clock was actualized and became a participant in legal investigations. He recounts his early experiments as such. Gregorius realized during the course of these tests in Romania... Sorry, I'm moving through, not what he is. Gregorius realized that during the course of his tests in Romania that the European Union, with the exception of the United Kingdom, whose case I will return to, plus parts of Ukraine, are interconnected by one vast electrical grid. The oscillations in the frequency of the mains buzz are a result of the electrical grid's function to avoid power surges, and therefore regulate the distribution of electrical current. Therefore, the electricity grid stabilizes the distribution of electricity across the continent, which in acoustic terms means that it maintains the same buzz across the grid. This meant that from the Gregorius' lab in Romania, he was able to create a database and archive of mains hum, which allowed him to analyze recordings and ascertain exactly when they were made for cases that he would later work on beyond Romania's borders, such as Germany, France, Spain, Cyprus, and Denmark over the next 20 years. Interestingly, this database began 10 years before the European Union formally included Romania inside its legal jurisdiction. For legal reasons, Gregorius could not share with me the details of the cases he worked on, though he did summarize a few circumstances where his analysis has been most effective. Firstly, the timestamp of a mains buzz can be used as a way for someone to prove that they were at where they were at a specific time, a kind of alibi. The recording of the buzz can work like an alibi, so that if the police accuse you of being present at a crime, and you have a recording of yourself somewhere else with a conflicting timestamp, the ENF analysis can be effective in proving the exact time of the recording, and thus proving you were not present when the crime happened. Secondly, proving that someone has prior knowledge to a crime is often important in legal disputes as a point of contestation in corruption cases. Here, ENF analysis could be used to prove somebody knew something before they claim that they did. For example, there is a recording of someone speaking about illicit activity, and they would be guilty if they can be proved this recording was taken before a certain date and time. They had prior knowledge of the event. Finally, to come to the most commonplace use of ENF, someone is caught on a recording that is being used as evidence against them, but they know the recording has been edited to make it sound as if they said things they didn't say, or that contextual material has been edited out to change the sense of their statements. In this case, the timestamp of the mains buzz at different moments of the recording would prove that it has indeed been edited, by showing that the mains buzz is composed of a patchwork of different times pieced together. This last example was crucial evidence in the conviction of 3 men for illicit arms dealing in 2012. It was a trial in the UK, where ENF analysis allowed prosecutors to show that a wiretapped voice recording, which became vital to their case, was unedited and therefore authentic. This is contrary to defense lawyers of the subsequent victims who had of the subsequently convicted arms dealers had suggested that the recording could have been edited by the police to incriminate the accused. However, ENF analysis showed that the pattern of the mains buzz oscillation throughout the entirety of the audio recording matched a buzz from their database that correlated to the same time the recording was made, proving that there were no interventions and that the buzz was continuous with the National Archive pattern of oscillation across the country. This trial, as well as leading to the conviction of the arms dealers, revealed for the first time that ENF analysis was being used not only by Gregorius in mainland Europe, but also by British police as a form of surveillance system. This piece of information communicated for the first time that whether emitted from a neon light in Glasgow, a fridge in Southampton, or a laptop in London, the police were recording and, if necessary, listening to the nation's buzz. And yet, for just the police to listen to that buzz is not acceptable for me. So I produced a system where we could all actually archive and have access to that same database, though mine only begins in 2016, when I built the Hummingbird clock, this clock that is annoyingly buzzing in the background. This Hummingbird clock is an online database of that buzzing sound, and it has a system where people in the UK can actually submit recordings, submit a claim, and we can test it against our database if such time contests become important for their legal and personal uses. So it's really kind of reclaiming the nation's buzz and giving it back to the nations. Then this is a kind of, for me, this sound is a kind of national anthem. This clock is one of many established and emerging audio techniques designed for legal and investigative purposes to document the tensions and conflicts that emerge with the expansion of the frontiers of listening and its implications for the attention given to the foreground and background of an audio recording. Such tensions between foreground and background need to be approached with caution and sensitivity. On the one hand, a sensitivity for those voices and silences that are subsequently unheard or overheard. On the other, for the inner workings of the technological principles that codify these listening practices into law. Because the implications for the speaking subject need not be part of the same narrative of privacy and agency that we all too readily ascribe to the speaking subject in the face of surveillance today. The expansion of these audio technologies beyond the capacities of human hearing play a part in an exclusionary process where human vocal agency is being transformed and in the process is losing some of its political potency. Yet at the same time, and by the same means through which these technologies expand the horizons of the audible, they produce new forms of inclusion where sounds previously designated as noise or silence become able to speak. Of course, not forgetting that, only 80 years ago, women's voices were considered noise. As I am asked to make the provocation here, I will argue that fighting for imperfect legal conventions such as Fourth Amendment rights in the US to be upheld in the face of such transformations in listening is a conservative approach. So the call to Fourth Amendment and privacy is a conservative approach in the face of such technologies. It fails to recognize the conditions of listening have themselves transformed and so render such older legal conventions irrelevant. My argument is that we should not contest but be sensitive to the nature of these transformations to listeners' capacities and methodologies, because they are indicative of the ways in which the speaking subject must also transform and expand to include at the very least the murmuring of their internal organs, and further, the electricity humming in the background, the reverberant echo of the room in which they are situated, and so on. We must kind of become background, or become one with it. Just as surveillance moves so fluidly between foreground, subject and object, foreground and background. That wherever technologies of forensic listening are used to recalibrate the legal ear as to what constitute legitimate forms of speech, they have both exclusionary and inclusionary potential. Out of this acknowledgement, an expanded sense of the speaking subject can emerge, so that when someone pauses their speech, this silent pause containing the sounds of their background can be understood, measured, and its value weighed proportionally to the political demands it seeks to make. This sometimes difficult transformation of the legal conventions that apply to our voices, including their complete silencing, necessitates too a transformation of the way we think about political agency of speech. Rather than falling back on the languages of the law that preceded these new abilities to listen at the fringes of human speech and human sonic perceptibility, we must learn a new legal parlance, like Grigoris did to learn this new language of buzz. Rather than foreclosing the possibility of an electric hum to speak, which is what the Fourth Amendment would do, we should ourselves be learning how to speak mains buzz, that is, to speak back with the same intensity and expanded context with which our voices are now being heard and our world surveilled. With the expansion of legal listening into our bodies and across the oral environment that they occupy, the borders of the speaking subject must expand beyond the verbal capacities alone, alongside these technologies into its background surroundings and beyond its individuality. Where our individual voices might be receding to the background as a result of technologically expanded forms of listening, they can potentially re-emerge as part of a collectivity of sounds. Thank you very much.